it's going live. Just a second. All right, then we're live. Hi there, Jeremy. Hi,
Vasco, how are you?
Tom. So we have a tag team of authors for this session today. We'll start in a minute, and let me just introduce you quickly. Tom is the at least for me famous speaker and host of the Spamcast.
Absolutely. 18 years plus on topics across the whole IT kind of
Yeah, I
world.
mean you started even before Agile.
Oh yeah.
Wow.
Well, I think yeah, it was. Well, no, it wasn't. 18 years ago, it was just barely at the beginning of Agile, but I didn't believe in Agile at the time.
That's why the Spamcast is called Spamcast.
Software process measurement. It was cute. 18 years ago, it was cute, right?
And you also like spam. It's a
Well,
perfect
well,
riff
that's
on your
true
love
too.
of spam.
And
Absolutely.
Jeremy is a musician who ended up working in IT to pay
Oh,
his
sure.
bills. Is that so, Jeremy, or did I miss something critical there?
Oh, musician, writer, background in doing both of those things. But the IT thing is what's become my current passion and obsession.
And he was always the cool kid at work.
Yeah, and still is,
You
obviously.
you still make me blush when you say that,
Maybe
Tom.
not a kid anymore, but still the cool
Yeah.
person at
Well,
work.
thank you.
Compared to me, he's a kid.
Well, now both of you are authors. How many books do you have between you two?
But well, we wrote one together. I have two or three others.
Yeah.
Very good.
And my first book experience was with Tom, and it was lovely. It really was. It maybe we'll get into a little bit of storytelling here in the live session when it starts, but the whole experience was really excellent. And I think that we really made a good pairing to write this work. We held each other accountable, and we did all the stuff that, you hear about horror stories of people trying to write books and they take 20 years to get something out. But that was not the experience that Tom and I had. I think we had a pretty good sustainable pace, if you'll allow the connection to the manifesto.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's just get started then, shall we? Welcome, Agile friends. My name is Vasco Duarte, and I'm your host for this live session with authors, speakers, and podcast host Thomas Cagley. We'll call him Tom. Hey, Tom.
Hello, Vasco.
And Jeremy Willets. Hey, Jeremy.
Vasco, it's great to see you again, Vasco.
So we have Tom and Jeremy. I almost said Tom and Jerry again. We have Tom and Jeremy here with us today to talk about mastering work intake. As is described in the back of the book, work intake is a challenge you have to deal with constantly. And I really like that phrase because it is true, and especially as product owners. And Tom is also the author of Mastering Work Intake, as well as the host of the Spamcast. And before we get into the discussion, remember that there's quite a lot of other sessions on the Product Owners Summit. There's a live session tomorrow with Raul Bhattacharya, where you can get live coaching as a product owner from experienced product owners. So check it out, productownersummit.org, and the live session with Raul is tomorrow. But
That's
now
certainly, by the way, better than dead coaching, right? Live
yeah,
coaching dead. I'm sorry.
Coaching with the
yeah.
pulse.
See, they're also comedians, not just authors and musicians. Their
That is definitely not paying any bills, Vasco.
their career span is growing
our
as
comedy is
we
very
speak.
our comedic sensibilities are very niche.
So we're of course talking to product owners. So we're going to talk about
Yeah.
work intake from the product owner perspective. And let's start with a concept of the 9 core principles of work intake for product development teams. Could you, Jeremy and Tom, whoever wants to start first, could you describe these 9 principles?
Sure. let's go through all 9 of them. So maybe we'll tag team, Tom. I'll take one. I'll take the odds, and you'll take the evens. So prioritization is sort of the first one that we've identified, and this is the thing that I would hope that product owners are very familiar with. I mean, prioritization and prioritizing a product backlog is kind of like table stakes to be a product owner and call yourself a product owner.
Control. I mean, very frankly, if you have whether you call it a backlog or whatever you call it, pile of stuff, unless you control what, have a defined path, what goes in there, then it's just chaos.
Transparency. So this is the idea that anybody can see what's on the backlog at a given time. So whether transparency for you is a wall full of index cards or an electronic tool, that's also a requirement for good work intake.
Sorry, I had to grab my head when you said the tool, because unfortunately, that's a lot of where, stuff goes into tools. People stop seeing it. They stop paying attention. And you end up, I was working with someone the other day that had a list of things. I won't even call it a backlog, but it was a list of things. It was 500 long. And I asked them, when do you actually walk through this thing? And it's like, well, I never get past the first 50 ever. So it's like, who cares, right? It's not transparent. But consistency, how you decide what goes in there. I mean, work intake is not only how much and what it is, but it's about how you qualify and get it there. So having a process to get it there, and I know process can be a bad word in Agile, but having a project that you consistently do is a big deal.
Frequency is number 5, and that's one that the whole work intake conversation is never a one and done thing. It must happen frequently, whether you're talking about a Scrum team having a work intake conversation during a backlog refinement session or sprint planning. It needs to happen frequently.
You have to be ready. So just winging it isn't a scenario. So preparation, getting the work that you think you're going to want to do or want to go through and prioritize or at least discuss, you have to know what it is. Human beings are really good at making stories up. And when in the absence of information, it's like a vacuum, and nature abhors a vacuum.
Respect. So now we're getting to some of the more, I don't know, esoteric is probably the wrong word, but now we're getting to some of the less tactical ones, the more higher level ones. And so respect, the folks who participate in the work intake process, whether they're the product owner, the people doing the work, the team members, or even, your Scrum Master, Agile coach folks, or even executives, they have to have some level of respect for how this works, because if they don't, the whole thing will fall apart.
To be honest with you, they might be esoteric, but in day-to-day operation, if we think about the organization as a multi-tiered kind of thing at the team level, right? The product owner is the one who has to have absolute responsibility for this respect thing. Mm-hmm. So, you can shave the edges maybe on some of the others and say that people participate without the product owner's respect for the process. The wheels come off. The idea of consequences are a big deal also. And just think of it. If you're going to an underground and walking through the turnstiles and somebody's jumping the queue and running in, it makes life more difficult for everybody else. There has to be a consequence to both good and bad behavior.
The last one, so number 9, is ownership. And that's one that ties nicely to the folks that we're talking about in this session, product owners. The phraseology we use in the book very much mirrors what's in the Scrum Guide when we talk about the product owner role. Someone is responsible and accountable for work intake. That's how we define ownership in our book. And the Scrum Guide uses similar language to talk about the product owner role and the product backlog.
So go ahead, Tom, go ahead.
No, I mean, realistically, the product owner role, and we're talking a lot at the team level right here, but the product owner role, if we think about who's accountable, who's responsible, who participates and advises, the reality is the product owner role at this level is responsible for all of this stuff. They're the ones who have to, on a day-to-day, make this happen in a tactical way, right? They have to translate that strategic that might be coming down from product, the higher level product people, to the team, but they have to make this stuff work. Everybody else needs to participate and advise, but as soon as we start to pull that responsibility away from the product owner, then things get a lot more complicated.
Yeah, in fact, the question would come next is, okay, if we're pulling it away from the product owner, where does it go? One thing that I really like about you bringing up the topic of work intake, which is something that I've been talking about, not with those terms, with different terms, a lot also when I talk to teams about delivering on time and the no estimates ideas, is that there's very little we can do to make something that takes long happen faster. But it's very easy to deliver something if we remove work from the backlog, right? So how do you guys tackle that aspect? Now, speaking directly to product owners who are listening to us, how do you tackle that aspect in your 9 core principles of work intake about making the decision of what gets to be on the backlog, or at least on the sprint backlog, or not, like what is removed, the work that is not done? How do you discuss that with your product owners?
I think it's the preparation principle, Vasco. I think that's the one that jumps out to me when I think about this equation. Preparation is not just sitting in a vacuum as a product owner and refining backlog items. I think that the people who are listening to this, if you take one thing away from our conversation besides that 9 core principles concept, you need to be external facing. You need to collaborate with people across your organization, across your team, to understand what that level of priority is and what you need to do as a product owner. The preparation one is the one that jumps out to me as the most essential. Tom?
I'll tackle this from a little bit different angle and answer it just slightly out of phase to the question. Arguably, right? Arguably, in any organization other than a entrepreneur or singlepreneur kind of scenario, there's a hierarchy. If we think about the middle layer of the organization, the product, and we'll just use product management, the product managery kind of role. The product managery kind of role translates that strategy from the executive level to, in conjunction with the product owner, into an actionable plan. The product owner then takes that and translates that at the team level or at a group of teams levels, depending on how that gets fractured out. But it's that translation of strategy and then basically applying, whether it's preparation, prioritization would be a biggie in my mind, in taking that strategy and making it tactical at a team level and saying, you know what, there's stuff on this list that doesn't match the strategy. Therefore, I'm either taking it off the list or I'm pushing it down, right? And we work the prioritization level in that scenario. But it is that communication, that intimate communication, whether it's with the larger part of the organization. But I think at the same time, it is critical that it aligns with the strategic part of the organization. I don't, in Jeremy's real world, right, where he actually works for an organization. I work for a number of organizations, and you get a little different real world. But a lot of times when I look at what's getting prioritized, because of all the pushing and shoving that goes down the organizational politics, it doesn't match strategy anymore. And people think, and we actually worked for a company once upon a time where people thought at the high level that we were going in this direction, and actually we were sort of meandering about in some other direction. Not because anybody really got it wrong, but because there wasn't a connection between strategy and tactics through prioritization. And that, you have to put that on both the product management and the product owner roles.
So what are some of the tools? So you guys host a workshop based on the book that you wrote, the Mastering Work Intake book. What are some of the practices that you introduce in the book and then also in the workshop for product owners, and it is many of us who are struggling with that process of deciding specifically what not to do?
I think the first step that we've recommended, both to the people that have read the book, but also the people in our workshop, is to understand their current state. And so we've come up with a couple of different activities that are in the book, but also in the workshop that we facilitate that get a sense of the current state of work intake in the context of the people participating in the workshop. So to Tom's point, we have an activity where we try and figure out the connection between high-level organizational strategy and what's happening at the team level. What percentage of work is the high-level strategic stuff that gets decomposed into team-level stuff? What percentage of work follows that, the sort of the typical happy path that gets evangelized in frameworks like SAFe, where you take a big chunk of work, break it into smaller pieces, it gets distributed across teams, and then boom, it magically gets done. So we've got activities that do that, but we've also got activities that focus on who the people are, because as Tom was poking at earlier, this whole product owner role, I think in our perspective, has gotten really darn complex over the past few years in terms of how it actually works. The Scrum Guide is a short work. It does not at all resemble the product ownership role in the context that I work in. There's a lot of different things at play in the product ownership role, which Tom started to describe. And so one of the activities we really enjoy doing with people is to help them start to think about who is responsible for work intake decisions, who's accountable for that. Because only then, once you understand what's actually going on, can you then start to think about how to change things.
I'd actually love to hear comments from the audience if they want to, share now or later. What happens when you really make people at that, for those kind of decisions, both accountable and responsible for the same decision? And how does that really work out in the real world? But, to Jeremy's point, I'll say this real simply. It's a matter of starting by visualization. This whole idea that if you want to go all the way back in time to early in the Agile movement, this idea of visualizing work, or heck, even go further back into the lean world, right? Idea of visualizing the work and how it flows, where it comes from, that starts to peel back a lot of different layers of the onion. And things that we're comfortable with when we are just, we put our hands over our eyes and pretend it's not there, it's real hard not to be stopped being comfortable with them. I mean, how many times, whether it's at a middle management level or a team level, do you get the infamous tap on the shoulder that says, hey, I just played golf, or I just got a call from the client, and suddenly the whole world changes? Jeremy, we went down, we go down early in the workshop and early in the book, this idea of a happy path, from the high level product, initiatives down to the teams. And, in a perfect world, somebody might actually think that, it translates, but in reality, in real life, it almost never does, right? All sorts of things are coming in, and you have to see it. You have to talk about it. If you don't see it and you don't talk about it, there's nothing you can do. So visualization is, part and parcel. And the hard part is, I'd love to say, pick up the book, read the book, do the exercises. You'll get there. But I don't think any of this stuff is as easy than if you do it as a group, and you don't need us to do it, right? Grab your team, have that conversation, do the exercises in the book, And very frankly, you're going to hear, assuming there's psychological safety, you're going to hear a lot of different stories as a product owner that perhaps you didn't want to hear about,
Right.
but yeah, see no evil, hear
That
no
too.
evil, that kind of stuff.
That too.
Oh, if you
But
don't hear it, you can't do anything about it.
so
Exactly.
taking that further, and Jeremy already mentioned this topic with the idea that the product owner role has become so complex over the years. And I can totally imagine why you wanted to write this book, because a lot of the problems we see downstream, teams and production and delivery, start with deciding what work to work on, right? Start with the work intake question. So how have you seen the product owner role evolve in recent years, especially in relation to work intake? And how do you intend to support that evolution of the product owner role with your 9 core principles?
Sure. I've seen, from what I've seen with product owners that I've worked with in my current company versus the past history I've had working with product owners, they've had to be way more collaborative across the enterprise. They've really had to start to build a lot of internal connections in ways that I don't remember having to be done at the last place I worked. The last place I worked, it was very much like, here's your product that you own. You have domain over making decisions around it. And it was kind of just go, which was somewhat liberating, but also for me, it didn't necessarily have some of the customer centric guardrails that I think this role needs. You need to have those constant touch points with customers. Whereas what I see now in my current context are product owners who can no longer just be team facing. They need to make sure that they are external facing as well, external across the enterprise, but also external across customers. This role is very high profile in the place that I work right now. It is not meant to just be a backlog order taker kind of role. And so I would hope that that's kind of the vibe that your product owners that are listening today are sort of starting to feel in their context too. I think this role is more important than ever.
I don't know that it's more important than ever. I think it's always been absolutely critical, right? So, and it's always been extremely hard. I think that it is being built in. So my observations, and again, they're observations from working with clients, is that this role has now been institutionalized and in many organizations. And the idea of product has been institutionalized. What hasn't happened is that the organizational structures and hierarchies don't and haven't yet matched that product point of view. So you have product, which we would think of as cutting across, right? Whereas we have lots of different silos of work, still in that interaction. So where I've seen more time spent with product owners is in negotiating and understanding, all of those different boundaries between the silos. And, it would be nice to say, wave a magic wand, take these, whether they're release trains, if we want to use a safe word, or products and make them into, nice, tight organizations. And Jeremy and I worked in an organization that was close to that. It actually, he's had started to think about that. That's rare. And a lot of product owners in organizations where the software they're dealing with is packages and cloud and this and that, they're dealing with a much broader palette now because it has been institutionalized than just the pure product development people. And so it's harder, right? So coming up with a consistent practice, coming up with a way to make this transparent, coming up with a scenario to deal with, some of the real horror stories that we've both seen, where you get a business product owner and a technical product owner, and maybe other product owners all trying to work together. that's it's gotten complicated that way, right? It's gotten complicated organizationally because we've attempted to fit this into scenarios where we haven't made the changes to the organization to make it work.
I think that's a very good point. Now, I don't know if you tackled that topic in Mastering Work Intake, the book or the workshop, but what are some thoughts you have about how we may need to look at organizations in order to support this role that at least, I mean, you say and Dave West said yesterday has become critical for the digital age?
One of the things that we're doing, right? So we do, again, I think if you walk through the exercises, you get to that point. It's not as crystal. It's one of those things. You write a book and 300 pages in, you go, well, we could write another 500 pages and deliver it some, next century kind of thing. At some point especially when you're dealing with a publisher, they're going, excuse me, gentlemen, I have a time window you need to ship. We're actually working on some ancillary, pieces to look at that translation between, what I would consider more of a happy path, right? The executive to the product management, and then layering out all the other side problems. We were drawing that last Sunday and passing stuff back and forth. So again, the book addresses it with the exercises by visualization. It'll highlight that. It'll allow you to get to consistency. Again, doing a group, things like the cohorts, make that, I think, significantly easier because we can talk to people, that we don't normally interface with, and they see things differently than you do. But we're also taking it a bit further and looking at, sort of DORA kind of decision matrices, right? Where we have to figure out who's accountable, who's responsible, who's participating, those sorts of things.
Jeremy, your thoughts about how the organizations need to evolve to support this critical role?
Sure, I'll take it a different way. And I'll think about who those product owners are ultimately reporting up through. I'll think about the organizational structure a little bit. So I think, Tom and I have both worked in different places. I think the place we used to work was undergoing this transformation whereby the product owners were starting to shift out of engineering and shift into a more maybe traditional product management kind of structure. So that's one sort of pattern I've seen and we've seen for who the product owner should report to. It seems like that would, to me, create less friction between those product manager roles as well as a product owner role. Perhaps it would instantiate a pretty clear career path for people who want to evolve from perhaps a product owner role at the team level to some sort of like a product manager across teams, a set of teams. The place I currently work has a lot of product owners that are working directly with engineering teams and report up through the engineering organization. There are definitely pros to that particular path. We have a level of responsibility and accountability in engineering to get work done, to plan work well, to make sure that we're doing all of those really great work intake practices. And we have that sort of within our own domain of engineering. We don't need to go tap product on the shoulder and say, hey, could you, come help us out with this particular activity. The challenge there, though, is product is a different organization. And so the product owners that I'm working with really have to work hard at continuing to build that bridge between their roles and our product management function.
When you think about that connection, one of the things that I am struck with or struck by is that a lot of the product owner people, so people implementing this role in practice out there, they come from an IT background because that's where the product owner role comes from, right? It comes from Scrum. Mm-hmm. And what you're describing, though, Jeremy, does hint more towards the fact that actually this product owner role, as it needs to be in place, it is a bit wider than IT. How do we navigate this conundrum?
Well, I think it's understanding the context of your organization first, understanding how people perceive your role, but how you think your role needs to interact across boundaries. But also you've got to think about the pragmatic approach to getting work done and how you're going to get work done most effectively. I think, certainly you could be a product owner and spend the majority of your time having external conversations, but is that really helping your team and your organization get work done? You've got to figure out what that balance is between inward facing at the team or, team or train, if you'll allow that term level, or external facing customer kind of work. I think it's something that people who are in the role are going to have to figure out based on the context of their enterprise and who they're supporting.
If they have the possibility of playing. I like the idea of going back to the future. And in the 80s and 90s, back before many of you were born, there was this idea that is much more akin to having true product flow, right? That you have all of the pieces, parts necessary to get the work done. Heck, sort of a cross-functional organization, and that the work flows through that, right? It doesn't transmit out. You don't have these external IT organizations. You don't have these, maybe some support things, but again, using that idea that we layered on later on in terms of IT and Agile, the idea of cross-functional teams, but a cross-functional organization. If we could get back to that, then this transmission about different teams, different parts of the organization goes away. And someone, whether it's a product owner, a group of product owners, and a product manager, can look over and say, you know what, what's important to the organization? We need more value. We need to derive more value, whether that's profit, cash flow, market share, whatever, and look at the work that's getting done and say, what's the stuff on this list that gets it there the fastest? That's where it has to evolve to. Whether it ever does, whether that, to Jeremy's point, meets the culture of every organization, who knows? But that's sort of that platinum standard that we ought to be testing against to know whether or not things work. That's why we focus, at least on the measurement side, on the whole idea of flow, because that allows us to say, are we getting more value? The stuff that we as product owners and product management want to get done, is more of that stuff getting done so that we can keep our nice, fat, wonderful little jobs.
So talking about flow, which is something that you also talk about in the book, one of the aspects to improving flow is to understand it, i.e. to measure it. So what are some tangible ways in which we could start looking at work intake and measuring it from the perspective of flow, also to be able to diagnose and ultimately solve problems with work intake activities?
I've really become a fan of flow distribution. I forget when Tom may have been the first one to educate me about this metric, or maybe it was Mick Kirsten's book, or maybe it was even Don Reinertson. But this one was just an epiphany to me, because at the time I found out about this, I was working with a team who was sort of perennially challenged by getting work done, like that management or the business always was expecting to get something at the end of a sprint or at the end of a PI, and they never were quite getting there. And so it was like, what's actually going on the team? And so when you start to think about the distribution of work with this particular team, one of the things I was able to do is put together a visual that described how much time they were investing in fighting bugs, in doing bona fide product development work. I think at the time, this particular team was spread across multiple different products, which we can set that aside and have that conversation be separate. But I think this is a really critical thing that I think product owners should understand. It's obviously I was not a product owner for this particular team. I was the Scrum Master, but surfacing this data and helping the product owner of that team understand where the team's time was being spent really enabled us to have rich conversations around whether we were spending our time in the right spots, whether we needed to invest more time in one or the other. It's the visualization element that Tom talked about is key to this particular data point.
The whole idea, you go back to Benson and others, right? You have to understand what you're starting and what you're completing. And what you're starting, the amount of stuff that you're starting and the amount of stuff that you're completing there has to be some relationship to. If you're starting more, you're going to end up finishing less. So that's, that's simple. It's flow metrics, understanding throughput, cycle time, flow distribution, a cumulative flow diagram across the entirety of your product. If nothing else, constructing it will tell you where all the silly boundaries are. And then again, taking, I've been in the quality end of the world for a long time. This idea of retrospectives isn't new. Stepping back and looking at where you have constraints and bottlenecks and determining what you can do about those things is a big deal. That ends up getting you there.
Can you give an example or a few examples of how you have been able to use these metrics to identify specific problems, maybe some that you have in the book?
Jeremy, you want to go first or you want me to?
You do it.
Okay. Relatively recently, I was working in a medical environment, and we introduced, basically, we had a team, actually we had multiple teams that were attempting to deliver minor changes, lots of minor changes, hundreds of defect changes on a monthly basis, just all sorts of things. But their work in process, so starting with measuring their WIP, they at any one time, you could take a slice of the work that they had on their plate, and they had 300 or 400 issues open. I mean, and some of them are human life and safety kinds of issues, but nobody knew, right? It was just a mishmash of things. The person playing the product owner role, it was like drinking water out of a fire hose. So what we did was we started constructing the flow distribution so that we understood and separated out those things that were truly human life and safety, because dead people don't pay their bills very well. And let's face it, why are we in the medical business? We're there to create value to our stakeholders, shareholders. So dead people aren't good for that. So fixing that was that. And we were able to measure the throughput of the process, found that 95% of those kind of problem tickets would go halfway through the team, stop, bounce out to somebody else down the street in a different building, then have to bounce back. Somebody would have to recognize that it came back, and it would flow through the end. So cumulative flow diagram, cycle time, those sorts of things led us to the point where we understood what the bottleneck, at least in that part of the process, was. And it was not a simple conversation, but it was a conversation that allowed someone to walk down the street and say, you know what, can someone come join our department? You don't have to change your reporting structure, because that might take 3 or 4 years, but come and sit in our department and actually do the work. And without bouncing it around. And suddenly the flow improved. It went up 30 to 40% almost overnight when that person was there. That was, again, very tactical kind of solution. But if you think about that, right, it probably translated into at least 1 or 2 people a month living versus dying.
Yeah, and also a much better feeling in the team, because they were actually getting things done. Let's not underestimate the impact on morale and motivation that getting things done can have as well.
I don't know about you, but did you see that at least employee engagement is at a critical low this year, the new Gallup. So that morale thing that you just mentioned,
it matters.
It matters a lot.
And product owners have a big impact on that, that's for sure.
Undoubtedly.
So, We're getting close to the end, gentlemen. Before we go, a resource could be, of course, we'll link to your book, Mastering Work Intake, and check out the link below the video description. But if you could recommend a resource, it could be a book, a video, a blog post, anything else that the people interested in this topic could go and explore further, what would that be?
Sure. I mentioned his name earlier, but Don Reinertson's Principles of Product Development Flow, a pretty seminal work. The material is dense, so please, product owners, don't be turned off by it. Tom's going to actually pull it off his bookshelf. It's a little heavy, but so much of it is applicable to the product owner role. I think it's a fallacy to think that book is just for Agile coachy, Scrum mastery people. All the stuff that we've talked about flow today are kind of grounded in that particular work, and looking at the flow of value across teams, across organizations. That's something product owners should care about, because as we know from the Scrum guide, right, the product owner role is all about maximizing the value from the development team. And so if you don't know how that value flows across teams and organizations, you should educate yourself and give yourself some tools to figure out how that can work. I think within that book, Cost of Delay is just, that material alone is worth the price of admission in that book.
I would throw on that heap, Why Limit Whip, Jim Benson. That's why I rolled behind me. My Reinertson's over there. This is a real bookshelf. I mean, realistically, we wrote this book to be sort of a follow-on to Why Limit Whip. And the ideas, of, why as a product owner, why as a team, why as an organization we should limit whip is really sort of table stakes to getting into, okay, we know we have to limit whip. Then what we wrote was, well, okay, so let's not wave our hands in the air. Let's figure out actually how to do it. But again, this is where I'd start, and this is a relatively quick read. Good. Well, you have your copy too.
But that was it. We chose the black mat cover, I think, in part because we were so inspired by Jim Benson's artwork choices.
Yeah, there you go.
I lost audio.
Sorry, that was my mistake. That was my mistake. So do check out Jim Benson's work. He was in the Agile Online Summit last year, October. So check it out at agileonlinesummit.com. But also do check out the book, Mastering Work Intake by Jeremy and Tom, as well as their workshop. And where could people go and find the workshop?
People can find it on Maven, MAVEN.com. It's a platform for cohort-based workshops. You can search for Mastering Work Intake. That's the title of our workshop. We've got 2 versions of the workshop coming up fairly soon. We've got an asynchronous, pre-recorded video-based version with live sessions that starts in about a week or so. And we have our more traditional cohort-based live session-y workshop that starts at the end of May.
We should throw around the word traditional. Traditional with something that's relatively new. The idea of product owners being traditional.
So, but maven.com and check Mastering Work Intake Workshop. So be sure to check it out. Tom, let's start with you. One last parting word of advice for our viewers.
You can do this. You can control work intake. Recognize that, there are friends out there to help you do that. But if you don't, if you just throw up your hands, well, no Agile for you.
It's not, just building on what Tom, it's not a sexy topic. It really isn't. That's sort of the premise that we started with this book. It's not something that you sit around and trade stories about, but it's a thing that really, really matters. It matters to product owners. It matters to value delivery, and it matters to the people doing the work too. It's really a skill that you need to master in order to get really good at product delivery.
Absolutely. It's a topic that matters to product owners, but also the wider organization. In fact, there is a little known principle in the Agile Manifesto, right? Simplicity, the art of maximizing the work not done. And that's right there on the work intake. Jeremy and Tom, thank you very much for your generosity, for being here with us and giving us your time and your knowledge.